Hey everyone, thanks for joining us. My name's Annie Yu. I'm an engagement editor here at the LA Times, and I'm here with Christopher Goffard, the author of our Dirty John series. It's been a phenomenal success for us. We've had more than 1.5 million page views to the story, more than 3.5 million listens to the podcast, so congratulations. Chris, for anyone who's watching on Facebook who hasn't read the stories or listened to the podcast, can you just quickly summarize that for them?
Yeah, Dirty John is a series about a man named John Meehan, who manages to insinuate his way into the life of an Orange County family. He's a con man, and he presents himself on a dating website where he meets a woman named Deborah Newell. He presents himself as a physician, as a former volunteer for Doctors Without Borders, and he shows up to dates in his medical scrubs. Slowly, Deborah begins to realize that he's not who he says he is, and it has very serious consequences for her and her family. So that's the story in a nutshell. In a nutshell. Great.
So our readers have submitted literally hundreds of questions for you to answer here today, but here I have just a couple of them, of the best ones. And for those of you who are watching live on Facebook, feel free to just drop any questions in the comments, and we'll get Chris to answer them. So the first one, the biggest one that we got for you was, how did you find out about this story? How did you, discover that there was such a big story behind what some people would dismiss as a random death in a parking lot?
Well, the story first came to light because a sharp-eyed reporter at the Daily Pilot down in Newport Beach named Hannah Fry found a mention of a strange death on the coroner's website. And she saw something about a guy being mortally wounded on in a parking garage. She thought it was probably a suicide, but she decided to make a call on it, and she broke the story. It was a 207-word story that ran on page 4 of the Daily Pilot, announcing that John Meehan had died, and the headline was something like "Man dies after being stabbed by a woman he was in an altercation with," police said.
Yeah. And
there was very little in the way of detail. They didn't identify Tara. They didn't identify the family dynamics that gave rise to all this. So she broke the story, and then probably 3 or 4 months later, I was having lunch with a prosecutor I know at the Orange County District Attorney's Office, and he said, "Have I got a story for you? You're not going to believe this one." And his office was trying to decide whether charges were warranted in this stabbing. Of course, they decided that it was a clear-cut case of self-defense, but they were closing the case without charges, and that meant that the story was actually gettable. And I ran down to the coroner's office and got the autopsy report, which said that which detailed all of the wounds that John Meehan received in the fight with Tara at the end, and he had 13 stab wounds, including one to the brain, and that's where the reporting really began. Really began in earnest.
Okay, so it was the prosecutor who told you, this is a crazy story, you should look into it.
Yeah, and this particular prosecutor, when he says that, I believe him.
Yeah, nice. We also had a lot of questions jumping off of that. When did the prosecutor tell you about the story, and then how long did this reporting take you?
I think we had lunch on Election Day, so that would have been November. And it took, so I've been reporting on and off. I've been doing other stories simultaneously, but it took me the better part of a year to put all of this together and to find all the people I needed to talk to, and build a level of trust where I could get the deeper story.
Yeah.
The podcast itself took probably 3.5 months. We did it at a breakneck pace. We partnered with Wondery in midsummer, I believe, and they brought in a veteran radio producer named Karen Lowe, who showed me a lot of tricks of the trade in terms of capturing audio, and it was a learning curve for me because I've been a print guy for 20 plus years, and this is the first time I've done a podcast, and the first time I've ever had to record interviews on a microphone for this purpose.
Okay, so you did all of your reporting first, and then you decided it would be a good podcast?
Well, I had a rough draft of the story written earlier in the year. I turned it in, And then editor Devon Maharaj said, this is a good candidate for our first big serial podcast.
Yeah.
Go back and get everything on tape. So that's what I did.
Yeah, was it different to kind of structure the story for a podcast as opposed to a written series?
Well, they wound up being complements of each other. So the way I wrote it is I spent the bulk of my time doing the podcast scripts, which is 50,000 words worth of scripts, and then I used those as the template for the written series. Although I was anxious that the written series not be viewed as an afterthought to the podcast, but a legitimate and organic product on its own. And so there's stuff you'll find in the written series that you won't find in the podcast, and vice versa.
Yeah, I can attest to that. We had a lot of questions from readers, especially about how did you get the family to open up to you and go on the record about the story?
Well, some of them didn't want to talk to me, and some of them never would. Some of them were reluctant and took a lot of talking to before they would. But Tara, I think, was eager to tell her story. You know, she'd had this horrific thing happen to her, and some people were coming up to her and saying, "Hey, I heard you killed a guy," and she wanted to, you know, completely out of context. And I think she wanted to set the record straight and have her story told. Deborah, I think, has the impulse to use her story to help other people. And there are some misconceptions about how we work. I've heard this from a few readers. The Los Angeles Times, for anybody who doesn't know, does not pay people for their stories. Deborah Newell, none of the participants were paid. She did this because she thinks that some good can come out of it. She thinks that a negative can be turned into a positive in some way. And judging from some of the emails I'm getting, that seems to be coming true, because people are sending me emails saying, "Thank you for telling this story. Please tell Deborah that she's not alone in what she went through."
Yeah. Was she hesitant at all when you first approached her to do this story?
Maybe a little bit, and I think she's a bit bruised now by some of the comments that people have directed toward her, questioning her choices and so on. But to them, I would say, look, how many people have the guts to come forward and talk with such openness and honesty about an experience this ugly and embarrassing. So I think she's brave for doing so, and I would just ask the people who are criticizing her to keep in mind that it doesn't encourage other crime victims to come forward when you publicly pillory those who do.
Mm-hmm. So a lot of our readers were also a little confused at the end, and they were asking, how does something like this happen to such a smart, successful, professional woman?
Well, I think there was a combination here. You had a person with a particular need. She was looking for love, and you had a predator who specialized in finding victims and finding their vulnerabilities. This guy, John Meehan, was a professional at what he did. He was a veteran con man, and he literally fed himself for years and years applying this particular con. And he was uninhibited, seemingly, by anything resembling a conscience. And when people didn't do what he wanted them to do, he turned nasty to a level that I can't think of anybody I've written about that quite approaches this level of concentrated malevolence. I mean, it was as if this guy had no ability to connect with other human beings in a genuine way, and the only way he could feed the void that was inside him is to find victims and devour them and throw them into it. And this is a pattern that repeated itself over and over in this guy's life. Even now, I'm getting calls from people that knew the guy since the series ran. I've heard from, I think, 4, maybe 5 of his ex-girlfriends. Mm-hmm. And they all tell variations of the same story. You know, one lady I talked to just last week, she said, yeah, we met on Match.com, probably around 2009, 2010, before he met Deborah. She says he was very charming, but also very secretive. She never saw his house. And finally, when she did, it turned out he was living in a ratty trailer in Cathedral City in the desert in California. And she got a look inside. She said he was a hoarder, an extreme hoarder. So there's trash everywhere, clothes everywhere, dental floss strewn about the place. It was like an RV, like a trailer, parked in front of a storage unit. And she said a light went off in her head when she saw this. And she said, John, look, I think our lives are going in different directions. And she broke up with him. And this is when his viciousness comes out. And his first move was to send her a long email enumerating all of her shortcomings and telling her, look, if you were only a better person in these 5 ways, you'd be fixed. And he launched a campaign to ruin her life. He called the Better Business Bureau on her. He complained to her employer. It was the same playbook that he always used. He just had this lust to destroy people's lives and would stop at nothing to do it. So this woman says she took out a restraining order on him, and she got a 5-year, 500 feet restraining order. And she woke up and looked out the window, and there was his car parked on her block just beyond the 500-foot boundary. This is the kind of thing he did.
So creepy.
So the pattern shows itself over and over and over in this guy's life. One of the things the prosecutor, Matt Murphy, told me when he looked at this case is that in all his years as a prosecutor dealing with homicides, he can't think of another case in which a single guy has had so many restraining orders from independent women who didn't know each other, who managed to convince different judges that this guy was scary enough that they needed restraining orders. He says that doesn't happen. That typically does not happen that often. And so I don't want to say that John Meehan was unique, but he kind of is in my experience.
Yeah. You mentioned John reported her to the Better Business Bureau. Was she also a successful businesswoman, sort of like Deborah?
Yeah. So his technique was to find people and then get as much information out of them as he could get in the guise of expressing genuine interest about them as people. So he'd go on a date and he'd ask you all about, hey, do you like your boss? Tell me about your boss.
It sounds great, right? He's interested in you.
Do you like your coworkers? It seems like he's really he's mining for data. He's looking for things that he can later turn against you. And that's what he did with this woman, and that's what he did with Deborah.
We have a question from one of our Facebook viewers, Jeff Dove. He asks, what's next, Chris? What's your next story?
I'm working on a few things, but my email address is christopher.goffard@latimes.com. If you've got story tips, feel free to send them my way.
Awesome. So back to Deborah. Did you at any moment ever feel frustrated either with her or with just the story as you were reporting it? This is a question from Allison.
My frustration is more with law enforcement agencies and getting records out of them, which is difficult in California. You spend a lot of your time begging and pleading. Yeah. I spent 7 years in Florida where they have something called sunshine laws, where the law's on your side and it's easy to get full police reports and names of victims and witnesses. Here, it's a much more elaborate effort as a reporter. So my frustration is the same as it is in a lot of these stories, is getting the documents I need. As for the family, I mean, less frustration than confusion. Metro editor Shelby Grad said in the end, reading the story, that it was a search for answers, or a search to understand. And when I think of the dynamic between John Meehan and Deborah Newell, I was trying to understand why she stayed in the relationship. And I think by the time you get to part 4 of the series, called Forgiveness, you will have a better sense of the family dynamics that played a role in this. I mean, this is a woman whose sister was shot in the head by her husband in 1984, and her mother forgave the shooter. And Deborah was raised in this culture of extreme forgiveness, and felt like something was maybe wrong with her, that she wasn't able to forgive her sister's killer quite as easily as she felt she was expected to. So I hope in the course of the series, some behavior that otherwise looks difficult to understand or inexplicable at least becomes a little more understandable, put into context.
Yeah, I definitely thought by part 4, it helped a lot as a reader when I was first reading this story, just to understand that dynamic with her mother and her sister. Let's see. There's a really great question from Irene Hernandez. She was asking if you've ever talked to a mental health expert to discuss John's personality and his behavior. She says she teaches abnormal psych, and she would diagnose him with antisocial personality disorder and narcissistic personality disorder. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I don't think that's a stretch. I don't think it's a close call even. I'm not a psychologist. I did talk to an FBI profiler, former FBI profiler, named Jim Clementi, who said that this guy basically checks all the boxes on the psychopathy checklist. I mean, he's got the narcissism, he's got the impulsiveness, the risk-taking behavior, the lack of empathy, callousness, Machiavellianism, tendency toward deceitfulness. Now, how he got this way, I don't know. I kept trying to find some catalyst in his childhood or some incident that might help explain him a little bit. But when you do that, you with this guy, you hit a wall over and over, because the level of nastiness this guy exhibited was way out of proportion to anything that was ever done to him. I mean, his parents split up. It was a very ugly divorce. His sister tells me he wasn't physically abused. I don't think he ever had a traumatic brain injury. But from probably even in high school, people I've talked to who knew him in high school say there was something a little bit strange about him. He had a sort of cockiness and a swagger and a sense of superiority,
Right.
A sense of narcissism, and his good looks afforded him shortcuts, and it was easier than going to medical school and becoming the doctor that he always claimed to be.
Yeah. We're getting some more questions from our Facebook viewers. Let's see. Emily Andrus is asking, do you think if John was alive today that he would ever come to any point of remorse or guilt for his crimes?
I don't think so.
Straight up, no.
I think that's a characteristic of a sociopath. They don't have a conscience in the way we would understand it, and so remorse is just not part of their makeup.
Great. And another question from J. Alexandra. Why do you think so many people blame the victim? And especially in this case, there's a lot of pretty nasty comments towards Deborah after this story.
Well, from the outside, it's maybe easy for people to judge, but I would ask them to think about the fact that we all have vulnerabilities, we all have a blind spot, and imagine that there is a creature out there in the world who exists solely to find yours and to inflict maximum pain on you once he finds it. That's a very scary scenario. I think in this case it was a combination of a predator who knew what he was looking for and a person who was vulnerable. And this is an extreme example, I think, of something that happens to a lot of people, which is they get stuck in bad relationships and they make compromises. And I think a reason that the story has been generating a lot of attention is that a lot of people can relate to it. Maybe they have a brother or sister or a mother or an aunt who's been sucked into a relationship that everybody on the outside knows is toxic, but that the loved one, herself or himself, doesn't quite perceive. So, yeah, it's an extreme example, but I think manipulative relationships are, they're happening on every block in the country. People in the middle of it don't always see what other people see.
Yeah. And a term that we often talk about when we were talking about manipulative relationships is coercive control. I believe we just had a follow-up story about that, right? Right,
which is an important story, and I'm really glad that we did it because it puts some of this stuff in context. And one of the statistics that we mention is that on average it takes 7 times for a person stuck in an abusive relationship to leave before they leave for good, which gives you an indication of how common this is.
So they try leaving 7 times?
Yeah, and they're lured back or whatever, and finally they manage to break away, and that's actually one of the points in which it becomes very dangerous, because the controlling person on the other end of the relationship, can get very scary.
Yeah.
So coercive control, yeah, it's not a phrase that I had been familiar with before I started reporting on this story, but it refers to a certain kind of relationship in which violence is not necessarily a role. One partner controls the other, or seeks to control the other in all kinds of small ways, like you must dress in this way, or you must arrange your shopping cart in this particular way, or people surveil one another. They'll install cameras. I need to know where you are at any point. And I think in parts of the UK now, it's now against the law if you can prove that somebody has been doing this to a partner. In the United States, it's not.
Yeah, and I think there's a larger conversation, too, around stalking and whether or not that should be taken more seriously with law enforcement. For example, he never actually hit you, so you don't get a restraining order. But oftentimes, someone who does regularly stalk women or men goes on to do something much bigger. So did that ever come up in your conversations?
Part of what was very scary about John Meehan is he seemed to know just where to pull up short. He'd go right up to the line and then pull back. If you listen to the conversations he had with his wife Tanya in episode 3, where he says he basically threatens to kill her, or he insinuates that he's going to have somebody kill her. But I think he got an anger management class as a result of that, and a menacing charge. And he was always, as far as I can tell, clever about not coming out and baldly saying anything that would land him in prison for a long time.
Yeah.
So he knew the law, and he manipulated it.
Sure. One of our most popular questions, actually, was just about a minor detail in the story. Who was the woman that Deborah walked in on who was wearing her clothes? Do you know?
Oh, with the Ovaltine and the little Bible?
Yeah. She was wondering if John knew her.
I don't know. I have a theory, but I don't really have any evidence to back it up. My theory is that she was some kind of drug connection that he had. Maybe somebody he supplied pills to, or that he got pills from, who'd been to the house before and knew how to get in, and had kind of wandered in looking for a shower or a bite to eat. I don't know. I don't know. The police did not give me her name.
Great. So you are also the author of Framed, which is also another true crime series we did out of Irvine last year.
Right.
So what is it about Orange County? Like, is it the character, the nature of Orange County that maybe contributes to these sort of shocking stories? This is a question from Sandra Mayhew.
I think probably what happened here could be replicated in a lot of other places. Could have happened in Beverly Hills, probably, maybe Palos Verdes. I don't think
wealthy places.
I think, John Meehan did not pick victims from whom there was nothing to steal.
Yeah.
Right? So there's the element of wealth, and I think that's why it happened in this particular part of Orange County. Orange County is a gigantic diverse place. It's not just Newport Beach, and it's not just Irvine, and it's not just people with money. But that's the part of Orange County that Meehan was drawn to, because that's where the money was.
Definitely. And why do you think it's important to tell these kinds of stories? Some people were a little confused why we were even running it.
Well, I hope it raises awareness about what it's like to have this kind of guy in your life. There are a lot of other John Meehans out there, I think, and this is the story they don't want you to read, because this lays bare the playbook, right? One of the most interesting parts of the series to me is this letter that Meehan writes to Deborah on their 1-year anniversary, which I lay out in
the love letter.
The love letter.
Yeah, I remember
that. He says 1 year and forever is forever, and he talks about how much he loves her and he wants to die in her arms, and the world would be a dark place without you. And it sounds so sincere. And he goes on in this saccharine vein for a few pages, I think. And you could read it and be forgiven for thinking, if you didn't know the context, that it was sincere, that it was a sincere and genuine expression of a guy's feelings for his wife. Yeah. And in reality, it's a guy who probably is incapable of feeling any of these things, but knows on an intellectual level what he needs to say, and is playing this elaborate ruse. And to me, that letter is one of the scariest parts about this, because it really gives you a sense of how good he was at wearing a mask.
Yeah, you can never really tell, I guess, just from the surface.
If you looked at that letter alone, you would think this is kind of an over-the-top, slightly cheesy love letter a guy's writing to his wife on their anniversary. But, well, I take that back. There's stuff in that letter that's actually very nasty.
Oh, like what?
It's nasty in the sense that he insinuates that the only way their love is going to endure is if she isolates herself from her family. There's a line in there where he says, we have just the two of us, not your nutty family, or something like that. And so he's making it very clear that she has to choose between him and her family.
It's that sign of control again, right? Like separating her.
Right. And the way I phrase it in the story is it's like a bonbon or a saccharine treat with poison at its center. That's what this letter is. But parts of it seem to be the work of a man, if you knew no other context, who is genuinely in love with his wife.
Yeah. We're getting a couple more questions from Facebook. Let's see, Jerry Wheeler is asking, how is Deborah doing now? Has she been able to trust a man again?
I think the last I talked to her about this, she said that she's not dating anymore, at least for now. She's back on good terms with her kids. She's working a lot. As for Tara, I think she likes that her story is told. She's been in therapy, and I hope she's getting better.
Yeah. Do you know about the rest of the family? Like, what about Jacqueline or?
Jacqueline liked the story. She sent me a note saying she liked the story. A lot of the rest of the family isn't talking to me, though. So it never did. So.
Oh, I see.
I don't know.
Okay. There's a really interesting question here from Joel Flowers. If John was still alive, what is the one question you would ask him to wrap up the story of Dirty John?
I'd actually be curious what readers and listeners say about that, because anything you asked him, you would receive in response a lie, and so the question becomes, what do you most want him to lie to you about? And I'd be curious to know what people would want to know about the guy. I'm not sure what you could ask him that would give you any more profound insight into the darkness at the center of him than we already know. I mean, I have a letter from the guy that he wrote to a friend in which he's hoping to get his his nursing degree back. And he basically gives the story of his life, and you get a clear sense of how he viewed himself, which is as a victim. Everybody from childhood on victimized him. His parents victimized him in their divorce. His first wife victimized him. The judicial system victimized him. Cops, judges, everybody was always cheating him and railroading him. And then this long list of women that he terrorized. He somehow worked it around in his mind that they had wronged him.
Yeah.
So I think if I were to talk to the guy, you would just get more in that vein. And I could be wrong. Maybe he would have come to some insight about himself, but I kind of doubt it. You just get a lot of lies.
Yeah. Have you ever written about, or just in general known, other men like John Meehan, or women?
I've written about a lot of killers.
Yeah,
I've written about serial killers.
Profiled so many.
But something about this guy, I got to say, has gotten under my skin in a way that nobody else I've written about has. I think it's something about the intensity of his malice and the way that he really made it a campaign. He made it his mission. He actually came out and said things like this when he tried to destroy people. He would say things like, "This will be my masterpiece." He's talking about, that was in the context of a woman that he had broken up with, that he was trying to destroy by sending intimate photos to her daughter's school, right?
Right.
He
sending naked photos to her family.
Right, right.
Okay.
Which is one of his tactics. He would coax these photos out of his girlfriends, and then he would find ways to use it against them.
Yeah.
But he would talk about this as if it were a trade that he took some pride in. You will be my masterpiece. That to me suggests a guy who thinks of himself as a professional.
Yeah. And a couple of our readers were also asking, how was John able to get away with doing so many similar things for so long?
Well, he was never caught for killing anybody. He did do time. He did time in Michigan, and he was busted in Ohio, and he did time in California.
Yeah.
And he may have
short stints. Can't remember.
Yeah, he wound up pleading to lesser charges in a few of these cases, but he would get out and he'd go right back to his computer and log right onto the dating sites again.
Yeah.
So he had a long prison record and multiple restraining orders, and the Laguna Beach police caught him, and they sent him to prison for stalking and terrorizing a woman.
How long would he usually spend in prison for stalking?
In that case, I think he only spent a couple months in prison itself, but he'd done maybe a year or two in county jail as a result of that charge. And then he would violate his probation. So he didn't seem to have any fear at all of law enforcement. And when the Laguna Beach police took out a request for a restraining order against him, that's one of the things they said. Even the cops were afraid of this guy. They called him a ticking time bomb capable of unpredictable violence.
Yeah. And even lawyers too, right?
Lawyers, so many people I talked to said, in my 70 years on Earth, or in my 40 years in law enforcement or whatever, this is the single scariest guy that I've ever dealt with. I never got to meet him, but something about the guy gave off a real whiff of sulfur.
Yeah. I think that's all the time we have right now, unless there's anything else you wanted to say to our Facebook audience.
Just happy that people are reading and listening.
Okay, great.
And I hope it raises awareness about an important subject.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, great. Well, thank you so much to everyone who's watching live on Facebook right now. If you have any other questions for Chris, just drop them in the comments. But yeah, thanks for watching. Thanks for reading. And you can find the story at latimes.com/dirtyjohn.